Snow still clung to the roofs along D Street when the town woke to the sound of boots on frozen boards and the easy clatter of wagons headed toward the mines. Virginia City liked mornings like that, cold enough to scrape the lungs clean, bright enough to make the whole Comstock look fresh. A little after 9, a neighbor crossed to a narrow, single-story house near Union, the place where Julia Bulette lived alone. She was expected at a friend's place and hadn't shown. That was unlike her. The neighbor rapped the door, called Julia's name, and tried the latch. Inside, the parlor felt too still. A shawl lay heaped on a chair, one of the bright ones the town knew from parades. The bedroom door was ajar. The neighbor edged it wider and saw a figure on the bed, dark hair against rumpled linens, one arm crooked wrong. By the time the alarm reached the street, the room was filling, first with women from the next house, then with a constable and 2 men from the fire brigade who had sprinted up the hill without their coats. They pushed close and backed away in the same breath. Julia was dead. She had been beaten and strangled. There was blood at the headboard and a dent on the plaster where something heavy had struck. The small room was stripped of what made it hers. Drawers were dumped, jewelry boxes were gone. The wardrobe stood open with empty hangers scratching the air where silks and furs had hung. The men worked awkwardly in that private space, trying to touch nothing they didn't have to. One of the firemen pulled the sheet to her chin. He had met her when she brought food to the engine house during a long night. She had a way of showing up when flames and smoke were still drifting off roofs, her skirts wet at the hem, a bottle or a bundle in her hands. Virginia Engine Company No. 1 had made her an honorary member years before, and she wore their cap in parades with the calm of someone who knew she belonged. Now they stood useless and quiet in her bedroom. Word moved faster than any deputy. By noon, the little house was ringed with miners in work shirts, storekeepers with aprons still on, and the town's newspaperman. Some had come to help. Most had come because they could not imagine the Comstock without her in it. The sheriff's men tried to hold a perimeter, but there was nothing to hold anyone back from. The killer had left hours ago, carrying what he could sling over a shoulder and tuck under an arm. Dresses, trinkets, a fur, maybe a ring. The crime looked like a night job by someone who knew she lived alone, someone who thought the town's love for her ended at the door to that room. Whoever it was had misjudged the threshold. Virginia City took the murder personally. The funeral 5 days later poured down the hill like a river of black and red. Firemen in their best shirts walked with their polished helmets tucked under their arms. The hearse moved slow behind a brass band that traded between funeral march and the thin, stubborn notes of a hymn. Men who had sworn never to spend good money on a bath stood washed and shaved. Women who never said her name in daylight stood along the boardwalk with handkerchiefs pressed flat to their lips. At the cemetery on the slope above town, a minister spoke of sudden death, of a woman who had fed the hungry and nursed the sick and ignored the weather when a bell rang. The earth there was hard with winter. When the ropes creaked and the coffin settled, the town's attention swung from mourning to the next hard thing: finding who did it. The first weeks brought more noise than leads. Drunks bragged and backtracked. An out-of-work man flashed a brooch in a saloon and claimed it belonged to the dead woman. It turned out to be his mother's. Someone thought they had seen a man slip away from Julia's house before dawn. Another swore the opposite. Deputies worked the pawn shops and the second-hand sellers in every camp around the Comstock, asking about dresses with unusual trim, about a fur that didn't match a miner's income, about jewelry that ran finer than local pay could cover. Spring came and went. The case felt like smoke, there to sting the eyes but impossible to grab. The break arrived the way hard breaks often do, with a small thing. In late spring, a French immigrant day laborer, a quiet man who hired on for odd jobs and sometimes baked bread for a boarding house, tried to sell a dress and some trinkets in a neighboring town. The stitching was too fine for his story, and his hands, scarred and work-worn, did not match the line he spun about a dead wife's clothes. A sharp-eyed shopkeeper stalled him and sent a boy running. Deputies found more in his trunk: a shawl Julia had worn at parades, earrings that someone swore she had worn by lamplight. He gave his name as John Millain. Under questioning, he admitted to theft, said he had slipped in after she was already dead and taken what he could pawn, said other men were the killers. The story shifted under him every time a deputy pressed. What didn't shift were the objects. They tied him to the bedroom where her life had ended. The judge moved the trial along with an eye to the storm outside. Every day the courtroom filled early. Minors leaned forward on the benches with caps in hand. Women sat together near the back, whispering when the lawyers pushed too close to details no one wanted to hear. The prosecution laid out the property trail, the tight timing, the way the defendant had tried to turn jewelry into cash and had stumbled over his own alibis. The defense floated other names and suggested the town wanted a neck more than a truth. No one disputed what had happened in the room. The question was, who stood there with the weapon and the line of cloth around her throat? The jury returned with a conviction. The gallows went up in April the following year, a scaffold framed against cloud and wind. Virginia City had seen hangings before. It had never seen a crowd like this. Thousands came, drawn by a mix of grief and the frontier faith that punishment could close a wound. A reporter who had once swung a pick in the district watched from the press row, scribbling notes as men jostled and swore and fell quiet when the condemned man stepped out. John Millain insisted he had not killed her. He claimed he had only stolen, that others were to blame, that he had been a fool but not a murderer. The noose settled anyway. The trap gave. The crowd exhaled as one animal. The rope did what ropes do. Back on D Street, Julia's house stood a while longer and then changed hands. The parlor that had held so many callers and so much talk turned into another room with another use. The fire company kept her memory at the station. A cap hung near the door, and the men told new recruits the story the way firemen talk, plainly, with a rough edge that hides tenderness. They remembered the way she moved through smoke with a pail, the way she showed up at a bedside with soup before the doctor did, the way she laughed like someone who knew how fragile a boomtown could be. They didn't talk about her like a legend. They talked about her like a neighbor. Years later, when the silver eased and the town shrank, the murder still cut through talk of strikes and cave-ins and the winter of '70. Visitors asked about her because guidebooks did. Old-timers answered because they wanted the story told right. They made clear that being a beloved woman in a frontier camp did not require the town to pretend she was anything other than what she was. It required them to weigh a person's deeds with the same hands they used to break rock. Julia had given when it counted. She had stood with them when the bell rang. When she died, they returned that loyalty the only ways they knew, by carrying her up the hill with honor and by making sure someone swung for it. The case never stopped raising angles and doubts. Some said the man who died on the gallows deserved it for the theft alone, that a town had to draw hard lines and hold them. Others, years later, wondered about accomplices, about the parts of the story that sit in the gaps any investigation leaves behind. There were claims of a confession, and claims he denied it to the end. There were rumors about a second set of boots in the alley, and whispers of a shadow on the stairs that turned out to be a coal scuttle. None of it changed the emptiness of her small house that morning, or the way the place felt too quiet for months afterward. Along the main street, photographs of the town's great days kept turning up in saloons, buildings draped for the 4th of July, a parade of firemen with polished helmets, a woman in a cap looking straight at the camera from the edge of the frame. Men tapped the glass and said her name. They didn't raise a glass to a myth. They raised it to a person who had lived among them at a time and in a place where everyone counted favors carefully. Julia's ledger of kindnesses given and returned was written in meals, in medicine, in steps taken through ash. When the worst thing happened to her, the town kept score the way she had kept it, face to face. If you stand on the hill where the cemetery looks down on Virginia City, the streets below still cut the same grid across the slope. The air is thin and dry. The wind pushes sound in hard bursts. The creak of a sign, a far door slammed, a truck on the highway pretending it is a wagon. The little house is gone, but the corner holds its shape. People still tell the story to those who ask and to those who don't. It sits in the town like the underground timbers sit under the mountain, hidden but holding weight. Men and women drifted through here by the thousands, chasing ore and luck. Julia Bulette stayed long enough to stitch her name into the place, and when someone tried to erase it, the town proved it remembered. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.